friends, it's Tori. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to have a serious discussion about a topic that has been kind of rambling around in my head for quite a few months now, and it is an issue that is incredibly prevalent in our fantasy genre. And I think it's something that we need to talk about more because it's so prevalent. And that is, as the title suggests, sexual violence in fantasy. Now, I feel like it is important for me to talk about this as a fantasy reader and writer with a female perspective, first of all, and also the perspective of somebody who is a survivor of sexual violence. And this is a topic that is not easy to talk about. It is so nuanced and layered. So the first thing that I want to say is that I am not going to try and give all of the answers in a single video. I simply want to talk about my experience reading fantasy and the prevalence of sexual violence in that fantasy, how it has affected me, and some of the major issues that I have found that I have with the portrayal of those kinds of incidents in the books that I read. Fantasy as a genre has never shied away from dealing with hard topics, right? We have grief, loss, betrayal, war, every kind of violence under the sun. We have, death and identity and trauma and genocide, and extend huge list of hard topics into the sunset here, right? And fantasy deals with all of them. Not every series, but you will find any of these issues sprinkled liberally throughout the genre. What I have always loved about fantasy is that it allows us to explore and express these hard topics through the eyes of a character, most of the time in a secondary world, which gives a sort of psychic barrier, a safety net, if you will, to our experience of those hard topics, and allows us to look at them from a slightly third-person point of view, which often is a more palatable way to confront these harder topics and give a long, hard look about how they affect us, how they affect the world around us, and do some thinking. Now, the reason why this video was so important for me to make is two reasons. First of all, the sheer prevalence with which I have experienced sexual violence in the fantasy books that I have read over the last decade plus of me reading fantasy. And number two is the way that I see the community reacting to it. And both of those things have really had me thinking a lot about this topic and how I wanted to handle discussing it. So let's start with the prevalence of sexual violence in fantasy. It's to the point now where when I pick up a fantasy novel to read and I see that there is a female, especially POV, in the fantasy novel, I basically set a timer and I'm just waiting for the moment when that character goes through an incident of sexual violence. And it's so prevalent, you guys. It's to the point where I can see the red flags coming a mile away as the character's being introduced, as we're seeing their relationships with the other characters or the path that they're taking through their life and the situations that they're in. It's like it's being set up from the beginning. I feel like it happens so often that I even feel myself distancing myself emotionally even more from female characters in fantasy novels oftentimes because I'm just expecting that there's going to be some sexual violence included in the story, and I am kind of protecting myself prematurely, just making sure. Now, I'm also not saying that this is not something that ever happens with male characters, but it happens so rarely in fantasy that I don't expect it. Sexual violence is horrifically prevalent in our reality as well, and it's not limited to one gender. And I think that's a very important conversation that I'm not going to go into in this video, but I wanted to mention it because I do think that it is very important for every victim to be heard and to know that they matter. So I wanted to put that in here because I think that that's important. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to be talking about female characters and the prevalence of sexual violence against them, because that is something that I feel like I can bring my perspective to as a reader and a writer. One of the problems with this being so incredibly prevalent is that it kind of becomes a default, right? Where you're going along and you know that these characters are going through really hard, awful things, and you just kind of assume, well, I know what she's gonna go through, because that's like the only thing that authors can think of to put their female characters through that's gonna be really big and heavy and awful and scary and you know, major for the story. Now, I'm not discounting that at all, because it is all of those things. But I think sometimes that default allows us to lose the nuance of the female characters outside of sexual violence. And that's where I start to have a problem with it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what specific parts of that I have issues with. Because I am definitely not saying that we should not address sexual violence in our fantasy novels. I think as a content topic, yes, it's important. And yes, I'm totally okay with it being a part of any character's story. It's not the what, it's the how. And that's what I really want to focus on in this video. It's not the fact that this topic is included for these characters. It's the how it's portrayed often that I find myself really getting upset with. The first thing that I have a major problem with is when it becomes the character's entire identity, right? This sexual violence incident happens to this character, and the entire story becomes only about that for this character. And that is really damaging, in my opinion, because it strips the character of all nuance. It reduces them to a single incident and basically defines their value for their story by this one incident. And that's really a problem, guys. That's really, really a problem. Each character that survives this kind of an incident obviously is going to carry that with them through the rest of their story. Their healing journey may look any sort of way depending on who they are and the resources they have at hand and the people around them. And that's also really important, because to me, the incident itself is less important than the healing journey and the aftermath of that, and how the character themselves is affected by it, because that puts the spotlight very directly on the survivor. And I think that that is a more responsible way to look at an incident of sexual violence. The second issue that I have when it comes to scenes like this is when it is thrown in as a gratuitous emotional shock value moment. It's very easy to tell when this happens, because basically the event happens, it's awful, it's horrible, it's very sensationalized, and then it's like nothing ever happened for the rest of the story. And that also does a grave disservice to survivors of sexual violence, because it cheapens the experience that they went through, right? So this is also a big issue I've seen in fantasy, where it feels like the author has just kind of sprinkled it in there as like oh, I know what'll get a good shock value in for my readers. Bam! And that's also something that I bounce off of very quickly and get very upset by, because it's so cheap and it's so frustrating, because the experience of sexual violence is such a horrific, life-changing thing that you should never ever use it cheaply in a story. It should be used very responsibly, know exactly how it is going to affect your character, why it is in the story, and what it does for the larger story. It shouldn't just be there to try to get a quick emotional shock reaction out of your readers. The third thing that I want to talk about, and this is the one that I get pushback on the most of my issues with sexual violence in fantasy. And this one's the hardest to talk about, but it's important because it's the most dangerous in my opinion. And that is when you read a story of sexual violence in fantasy that is borderline wish fulfillment. And I've read a few of those, and it's very hard to read. These are the kind of incidents in books that I bounce off of and will DNF a book for immediately. If I see language being used that is romanticizing sexual violence, or it is inflating it to the point where it feels almost like an adult film in the book, and it just, but I don't really have a lot of great words for that specifically, other than it's incredibly concerning whenever I run across a incident of sexual violence that reads that way, because it's glorifying the act itself, and it is glorifying the perpetrator, and it shows, in my opinion, a grave misunderstanding of the gravity of what is going on and the effects of sexual violence on the survivor. So I wanted to put that in here because we don't talk about that a lot in the fantasy genre, and there are so many scenes I have read that aren't necessarily what I would consider wish fulfillment, but definitely sensationalize and almost glorify the scene and try to make it as like gripping and engaging as possible. And I think that does an incredible disservice, first of all, and I do think that it can be very damaging to the reader's understanding of what is actually happening and how it is affecting the survivor. So now let's talk about the community response to sexual violence in fantasy, because this is something that this was the part that really prompted me to make this video, because I keep running across these scenes in fantasy novels all over the place. And then I started talking about them, and I have had some phenomenal conversations with other people in the book community about this topic, and I want to thank each and every one of you for digging into this topic with me, if we've talked about it, because I know that it can be a hard topic to talk about, but I think it's an incredibly important one, and I really appreciate everyone's perspectives on it. That's the good part. The backlash that I occasionally receive for speaking up about this is why I'm making this video. And it took me a while to sit down and map it out and figure out exactly how I wanted to talk about it, because I wanted to approach this topic responsibly, and I wanted it to be a conversation. I'm not here to call anybody out. I'm not here to, question anyone's experience. Or question author motives even. I'm just here to raise awareness about the topic itself and let you guys join in the conversation down in the comments with me. I'm looking for what your experience with this topic in fantasy has been and your thoughts on it. I would genuinely like to hear about it. This is a topic that gets a lot of pushback when I talk about it, and I wanted to bring up some of the most common responses that I've gotten to this. The first one is probably the most common, and this is when I have an issue with the prevalence of sexual violence in a story, whether it's just subjectively, I don't want to read about this right now and I'm having a hard time with it, or I don't think this was written well or responsibly, and but that's realistic. Oh, you guys. So yes. Sexual violence, unfortunately, is incredibly prevalent still, and it has been prevalent throughout our entire history as human beings, which is a horrific truth of the dark sides of being a person on this planet. That being said, it's important to handle all difficult topics, regardless of what it is, sexual violence and any other very heavy topic, responsibly. So again, it's not that it is included in fantasy, it is how it is represented in fantasy. And 2, just because it's realistic doesn't mean we need to constantly read about it. And if someone tells you that they didn't like the way a story handled a specific difficult topic, let them have that experience, because you don't know what they've been through. You don't know what their perspective is on that topic, and they may have a perspective on it that you've never thought about. So trying to get someone to just admit, well, no, but it's amazing because it's an amazing book and it's realistic, is just not a great argument. So let's just set that one aside on the shelf, okay? Like, let's just not use that anymore, please. This is a very subjective thing as well, because I recognize that everyone's going to respond differently to heavy topics, and so what someone's threshold might be is going to be very different from the next person, and we have to respect the fact that each reader is going to come in with different experiences, perspectives, and levels of like threshold of how much of that kind of topic they're able to handle or want to read in a fantasy novel, and that's completely valid. Just because somebody doesn't want to read about heavy sexual violence content in a book, that doesn't say anything about them other than the fact that they're not interested in reading that in a book, and that's okay. Another one that I'm going to bring up that I've gotten a few times that I think is important to mention, because I'm here in the spirit of honesty, and that is that sometimes my gender gets brought into this conversation where people will say, well, maybe you're just more sensitive to it because you're a woman. I'm not going to argue with that. I probably am a lot more sensitive to that because I'm a woman. But the word sensitive, I think, oftentimes gets thrown around as a invalidation tool. Like, well, you just can't handle reading about this kind of stuff, so maybe you shouldn't. And that's something that really has always bothered me, because reading dark content is not a badge of honor, okay? First of all. Second of all, my perspective on the female experiences of female characters in fantasy or any other genre is important. My voice is important in the reading community, just like everyone else's is, and I think we need to work on listening to perspectives outside our own more, instead of trying to tell people why they should or should not like a story. And the third thing that I wanted to bring up that I thought was a really interesting one, and I want to make a whole video about this because I think that this particular topic is just deserves its own video. I've been told that, well, maybe you're not the target audience. So telling me that there is a target audience for gratuitous, wish fulfillment style sexual violence content is incredibly concerning. It blows my mind whenever I hear something like this, because first of all, I've been a fantasy nerd my entire life. I've been a gamer girl my entire life. So if you think that it scares me coming into a field of art that I'm not the target audience for, you've got another thing coming. I'm so used to this, it's ridiculous. But what I want to say about this, outside of my own experience, is I feel like a target audience used to be a way to connect books to readers. And I feel like now there are so many instances where the concept of a target audience is actually used to push people out. And that's a problem, because any person can pick up any book and have things to say about it. They're going to bring a new layer to the conversation about that book. They're going to bring their own perspective and experiences, and that's valuable. As people interested in storytelling, that's like a basic fundamental truth of the history of storytelling, is people bringing stories together, people hearing perspectives on different stories. How many times have we heard completely opposite opinions about the same historical event, right? In our book community now, we have such a diversity of voices all adding to the discussion, and that is so valuable. It's so valuable. So telling somebody that they are not the target audience, especially simply because they disliked the way a certain heavy topic was handled in the story, is not nice. And it's not helpful to the community at large. And, you know, gatekeeping is its own topic, and I don't want to get into that in this video because that wasn't the point. But that's been probably the most surprising comment that I've gotten back when talking about my issues with sexual violence in fantasy and how it's handled. One of the things that I have found concerning at points in the community is how much grace is extended to the portrayal of sexual violence in fantasy. I feel like people do not speak up about the way that sexual violence is portrayed enough. I feel like calling out wish fulfillment when we see it, and obviously I'm walking a fine line here because I am not a cancel culture person. I absolutely cannot stand cancel culture. So I'm not here looking to take up arms against authors. I am also an author, so like that's not what I'm here for. But I think one of the things that has really stuck out to me in some of my reviews in the past is when I mention in my reviews that there is some heavy sexual violence, and I'm not sure I like the way that it's handled in my book reviews. I've had so many people who have said, oh my gosh, nobody has mentioned this before. Thank you so much for including it. Like, I can't believe nobody's talked about this before. And I think that that's important. I think it's important to call those things out. I think it's important to let other readers know that, yeah, this is a heavy topic that is handled in this book and how we felt about how it was handled. I think that's incredibly important. So, anyways, those are my very rambly thoughts about sexual violence in fantasy. I cannot believe I finally sat down to make this video. It took me a really long time to even feel confident enough to sit down and articulate how I felt about this, but that's kind of the gist. I'm curious to know how you guys feel about all of this and what you've seen in fantasy. Your own experiences, perspectives about it, please let me know down in the comments. I'm really looking forward to respectful conversations about it. If you are here just to tell me why my experience with sexual violence in fantasy is invalid, please consider moving on to the next video. But anyways, I hope you guys are all having a phenomenal week. I hope you are reading amazing 5-star reads with heavy topics that are handled beautifully, because there's so many of them, you guys. There's so many authors who do a great job handling a lot of really heavy topics, and I'm so grateful for authors who write with intentionality, no matter what they're writing about. Like, thank you for that. But anyways, thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for watching if you got this far to the end. If you liked my content, consider liking and subscribing for more of it. And yeah, I will talk to you guys in the next video.